The sun hung low over the jagged mesas, painting the desert in shades of gold and blood red. The wind swept dry sand across the barren landscape, whispering secrets of long-forgotten battles and lost travelers. In the distance, a lone figure stumbled along the dusty trail, his hat battered and torn, his horse nowhere in sight. The man's breathing was labored, each step a struggle against the pain that radiated through his body. His name was Caleb, a cowboy known for his courage, yet even the bravest hearts falter when faced with mortality. Caleb had been ambushed days earlier, a skirmish with outlaws that had gone horribly wrong. He had been separated from his companions, wounded, and left for dead under the harsh sun. His clothes were ripped, and his boots caked in dust. Every muscle ached, every wound throbbed, and yet he forced himself to move. He would not allow himself to die alone in the wilderness. Then she appeared, like a vision from another world. She rode silently across the plateau atop a sleek chestnut horse. Her black hair tumbled down her back, flowing like the shadows of the desert cliffs. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the horizon until they fell on him. The Apache woman was known as Nieli, a warrior feared and respected among her people for her unflinching courage and unmatched skill with a bow. She had been tracking a herd of mustangs when her attention was drawn to the figure struggling along the trail. Something in his desperate gait stirred her curiosity and her compassion. Nieli spurred her horse forward, her movements precise and fluid, until she was close enough to hear his ragged breaths. "Hold on," she called, her voice firm yet strangely gentle. "Get on my horse, handsome cowboy." Caleb looked up, squinting through the haze of pain. The sight of her strong, commanding presence brought a flicker of hope. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and words failed him. Nieli did not wait for a reply. With the strength of someone who had wrestled life and death many times, she lifted him onto her horse behind her. The horse responded instantly, galloping with the speed of a desert storm, carrying them across the sun-baked plains. As they rode, Nieli glanced back at him. Blood streaked his face, and his clothing was torn, but there was a stubborn spark in his eyes. He was alive, and by the will of the desert, she had found him before it was too late. She guided the horse through a winding canyon, careful to avoid the jagged rocks that could end both their lives with a single misstep. The canyon walls rose high on either side, their shadows stretching long in the dying light. "You will live," Nieli said, almost to herself. "You will not die alone." Her voice carried a promise older than the land itself, a vow whispered by mothers and warriors alike. No one faces the end without a hand to hold, a shield to guard them. Caleb could not respond, but he pressed his head against her back, letting the warmth of her presence steady his faltering pulse. The desert stretched endlessly, yet in that moment, it felt smaller, less hostile. Nieli knew the dangers: poisonous snakes, predatory animals, and the unforgiving sun, but she also knew that life was often measured not by the number of breaths taken, but by the strength found in the breath that remains. She was determined to carry him to safety, wherever that path might lead. As night fell, the desert transformed into a vast expanse of shadow and silver moonlight. The stars twinkled coldly above, distant witnesses to their flight. The horse's hooves struck sparks from the rocks, echoing like distant thunder. Caleb, exhausted but conscious, finally murmured a word. "Thank you." Nieli gave him a faint smile, her eyes still scanning the darkness ahead. There was no time for gratitude, not yet. Survival demanded vigilance, and she would not allow anything to claim him, not the desert, not bandits, not death itself. Somewhere deep in the canyon, a flicker of firelight glimmered, promising refuge. Nieli guided them toward it, her mind as sharp as the knife sheathed at her waist. The night was far from over, and the trials awaiting them would test courage, loyalty, and the fragile bonds that can form in the most desperate of circumstances. Yet for now, Caleb clung to life, and Nieli had vowed he would not face the end alone. And so, under the watchful eyes of the stars and the silent strength of the desert, they rode on, two strangers bound by fate, courage, and the unspoken promise of survival. The canyon air had cooled as night settled, carrying a faint scent of sagebrush and damp earth. The moon, nearly full, cast an ethereal silver glow across the rugged walls, turning shadows into long, twisting fingers that seemed to reach for the travelers. Nieli's horse moved steadily, hooves clicking against the uneven rock, guided by a quiet, instinctive certainty. Behind her, Caleb clung weakly, his body shaking from fever and exhaustion. He felt a strange mix of fear and relief, the harshness of the desert around them, tempered only by the warmth of her presence. "Stay still," Nieli instructed, her voice calm yet commanding. Her hands gripped the reins with practiced precision. directing the horse through a narrow gorge where a single misstep could mean death. If you fall, you won't survive the rocks. Caleb nodded weakly, though words failed him. The fatigue in his limbs was almost unbearable, and he felt the sting of every bruise, every scratch, every puncture inflicted by his earlier skirmish. He did not dare let his guard down, yet the ride, slow as it was for him, gave him a strange comfort, a sense that someone else was watching over him, someone fierce enough to defy the desert itself. The canyon walls pressed closer together, and the wind whispered eerily through the narrow passage. Naomi's eyes were alert, scanning every shadow, every glint of moonlight reflecting off rocks, looking for any hint of danger. She knew the desert had many hidden threats, the occasional rattlesnake, the lurking coyote, or worse, men with malice in their hearts. Her hand never strayed far from the knife at her hip. "You were lucky," she said suddenly, breaking the silence, her voice low but carrying a hint of curiosity. "Most cowboys don't survive what you did out there." Caleb tried to smile, but only managed a pained grimace. "Lucky, or stubborn?" he rasped. "Maybe both." Naomi glanced at him briefly, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Stubbornness can be fatal, but it can also make someone worth saving." She tightened her grip on the reins and leaned slightly forward, urging the horse through a jagged stretch of the canyon. Caleb felt every motion, every jolt, as if the terrain itself were testing his will to live. Yet, despite his pain, he felt an undeniable connection with Herhan, unspoken understanding that he owed his life to this stranger, who had appeared from the shadows like a guardian of the desert. Hours passed. The canyon gradually opened into a plateau dotted with scrub and hardy cacti. A faint orange glow flickered in the distance, smoke rising from a small fire. Naomi slowed the horse, keeping her eyes fixed on the light. "We're not far now," she said softly, almost as if speaking it aloud could make the fire grow closer. Caleb tried to focus, but his vision blurred. Every muscle screamed in protest, and yet, against all odds, he remained upright, driven by the sheer will to survive, and by the presence of the woman who refused to let him fall. When they reached the edge of the plateau, Naomi dismounted gracefully, moving with the silent, precise movements of someone trained to tread lightly across unforgiving land. She helped Caleb down, supporting him like he weighed nothing. Despite his struggles, the fire revealed a small encampment, abandoned for the night, but recently used. Naomi's eyes scanned it, her instincts alert. Satisfied it was safe, she lowered him gently to the ground. "Rest," she ordered. "I'll make a fire and clean your wounds." Her hands were sure and practiced, efficient in their movements. She tore strips of cloth from her own garment to bind his injuries, her touch firm but careful. Caleb watched her, overwhelmed by a combination of gratitude and awe. She worked in silence, her eyes never leaving the horizon, always alert to what might be coming. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows on the canyon walls, illuminating their faces. Caleb could see the strength in Naomi, the power that came not from muscle alone, but from discipline, experience, and an unwavering determination. He felt a mixture of admiration and vulnerability, the kind that only surfaces when one realizes that survival is as much about trust as it is about skill. "You saved me," he murmured, his voice hoarse, almost apologetic. I don't know how to repay you." Naomi's gaze softened for the briefest moment. "Live," she replied simply. "Survive, that's repayment enough." Outside the fragile circle of firelight, the canyon seemed to hold its breath. The desert was quiet, almost reverent, as if acknowledging the fragile thread connecting the two travelers. They were bound not by words, not yet by friendship or loyalty, but by the raw, elemental force of survival and the unspoken promise that neither would face the night alone. And so, under the pale light of the moon, Caleb rested while Naomi kept watch, her eyes sharp, her mind alert. The canyon was wide, the night long, and the desert still full of dangers. But for the first time since the ambush, Caleb allowed himself to believe he might live, because for as long as Naomi was there, refusing to let him die, he had hope. The night stretched on, each star a silent witness to their tenuous bond, and the fire's warmth fought back the chill of the desert air. Somewhere deep within the canyon, the desert whispered promises of trials to come, but also of survival, courage, and the strange, quiet magic that could arise when two souls met on the edge of death and one refused to let the other fall. Dawn crept slowly across the canyon, spilling pale light over the rugged terrain. The desert, harsh and unforgiving in the daylight, revealed jagged cliffs, scattered boulders, and scrubby vegetation that clung stubbornly to life. Naomi stirred the embers of the fire, coaxing a small flame to life to prepare for the day's journey. Caleb lay on a bed of rough blankets she had fashioned from torn cloth. His wounds bandaged but still aching with every heartbeat. "You should eat something," Nayeli said, her voice firm. "Even a small bite will give you strength." Caleb tried to sit, but a sharp pain shot through his ribs. He grimaced, shaking his head. "I can't." Nayeli's eyes narrowed. She knelt beside him and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. I won't let you waste away. You are not done yet." Her tone carried no question, only certainty. Caleb met her gaze and found something he hadn't expected. Compassion tempered by strength, a refusal to yield to despair. He took a shallow bite of the dried meat she offered and felt energy return. Slow but steady, like the tide creeping in over the sand. As they mounted their horses, the canyon walls seemed to shrink behind them. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of sage and sun-baked earth. Nayeli led the way, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for movement. Caleb followed behind, riding in silence, every jolt of the horse a reminder of his fragile condition. He stole glances at her, noticing the grace and focus in her movements. She seemed part of the land itself, as if she had grown from the rocks and wind, shaped by hardship and fire. "Why are you helping me?" he asked at last, unable to contain his curiosity. Nayeli did not answer immediately. Her horse picked its way carefully over a narrow ledge. "Because," she said finally, "no one deserves to die alone if I can prevent it. That is enough reason." Her gaze was steady, unflinching. "Besides, perhaps fate put you in my path for a reason." Caleb considered this. Fate. It sounded like a convenient word for something unpredictable, uncontrollable, and dangerous. And yet, the desert had conspired to keep him alive in ways that defied logic. And Nayeli had appeared like a guardian from a story he had never been part of until now. Their ride was not without peril. Mid-morning, as the sun climbed high and painted the desert in brilliant shades of ochre and amber, the distant sound of hooves echoed across the plateau. Nayeli stiffened immediately, her hand resting on the bow slung across her back. Caleb's heart thudded painfully. Bandits, scouts, or perhaps something worse, waiting in ambush. "Stay close," Nayeli commanded, shifting her grip on the reins. Her eyes narrowed, and she guided their horses into a narrow wash, using the terrain to mask their movement. The riders approached cautiously, hidden behind boulders and shrubs. Nayeli studied them for several long minutes. "Outlaws," she murmured. "5 of them, armed. They've likely been tracking stragglers." Caleb swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his own vulnerability. He could barely sit upright, let alone defend himself. Nayeli's presence, however, imbued him with a fragile courage. He would follow her lead, do as she commanded, because survival required trust, and in this woman, he sensed a wisdom born from years of hardship and danger. The outlaws were careless, their conversation loud and brash. Nayeli scanned the terrain, calculating the approach, noting the sun's glare and the direction of the wind. "We can avoid them," she whispered, voice tight with focus. "Follow me exactly. One misstep, and we risk everything." They moved silently, shadows among shadows, guided by Nayeli's intimate knowledge of the land. Every step, every hoofbeat was measured, deliberate. Caleb felt the tension coil in his chest, a tight knot of fear and adrenaline. But with Nayeli leading, he felt a strange reassurance, the kind that comes only when someone else bears the burden of danger with you. Hours later, having avoided the outlaws entirely, they reached a small hidden spring, a rare oasis in the barren desert. Nayeli dismounted first, helping Caleb down carefully. She guided him to the water's edge, allowing him to drink and wash the grime from his face. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of relief, a small spark of hope that he might actually survive this ordeal. "You're stronger than you think," Nayeli said quietly, handing him a strip of dried meat. "And you're learning to trust. That is the first step in surviving the desert, and in surviving anything." Caleb looked at her, exhaustion and admiration mingling in his gaze. "I don't know how I can ever repay you," he admitted, the words raw with honesty. "By living," Nayeli replied, a faint smile touching her lips. "By surviving. That is enough." As the sun began to dip once more, casting long shadows across the desert floor, they set out again, riding side by side. Two strangers bound by circumstance, survival, and the fragile trust that had begun to take root. The desert was still full of dangers, but for the first time Caleb felt he might face them not alone, but with someone who would not let him fall. And so, the canyon faded behind them, the shadows lengthened, and the journey continued toward unknown trials, new perils, and a bond forged in the harsh crucible of the wild. The desert afternoon was relentless. The sun burned overhead, turning the sand into a glittering, almost blinding expanse. Every movement left Caleb aching. Each step of the horse jolted his bruised ribs and seared cuts. Yet Nayeli pressed forward with unyielding determination, her senses alert to the smallest shifts in wind, the faintest echoes of sound, the slightest shimmer of heat on the horizon. She moved as if the desert were an extension of her body, each motion precise, economical, and deliberate. Caleb trailed behind her, leaning heavily on the horse's saddle. He felt every ache, every pang of exhaustion, yet he could not bring himself to complain. Nayeli's presence was a constant reminder that survival demanded perseverance, and weakness, public or private, was a luxury he could no longer afford. "Look ahead," Nayeli said abruptly, stopping her horse atop a small rise. She pointed to a narrow canyon cutting through the desert like a scar. A column of smoke curled lazily into the sky. "That's not natural," she added, voice tight. "Someone or something has been here recently." Caleb squinted through the heat haze. "Fire," he rasped. "Trouble," Nayeli corrected. She urged the horses to the edge of the ridge, peering down cautiously. The canyon below was littered with scorched brush and broken wagon wheels, evidence of an ambush or worse. Her hand rested on the knife at her waist, eyes scanning for movement. "Stay close," she warned. "We don't know if the attackers are still around." The descent was treacherous. Loose stones crumbled under the horses' hooves, forcing both travelers to move with extreme care. Caleb's injuries throbbed painfully with every jolt, but Nayeli's steady presence kept him anchored. She spoke little, but each instruction was sharp and precise. "Left," she said, shifting the horse to avoid a hidden crevice. "Steady. That's it. Don't look down too long." Halfway down the canyon, a sudden shout shattered the fragile calm. Outlaws, 5 of them, emerged from behind boulders, weapons raised. Nayeli's eyes narrowed. Her body tensed like a coiled spring. "Dismount," she ordered, voice calm but firm. Caleb's heart raced. He had barely survived previous encounters, and now, with his strength failing, he could only hope to follow her lead. Nayeli moved with terrifying speed. Her knife flashed, cutting through the air as she deflected an incoming blow. Caleb swung clumsily with a small club she had handed him, barely connecting, but Nayeli's presence gave him courage he didn't know he had. Every movement, every breath was calculated. The outlaws, confident at first, faltered under the precision and speed of her attack. In the chaos, Caleb realized something profound. Nayeli was not just a protector. She was a force of nature, a storm incarnate, and he was learning falteringly, painfully, to survive within her rhythm. With her guidance, he parried, blocked, and struck where he could, slowly finding a fragile synergy with her movements. The fight was brief but brutal. The outlaws, outmatched and disoriented by Nayeli's ferocity, retreated, limping and bleeding, leaving their wagon behind. Nayeli sheathed her knife, breathing heavily, but her eyes remained sharp, scanning for additional threats. Caleb collapsed onto a nearby rock, gasping for air, sweat mingling with blood and dust. "You did well," Nayeli said, voice low, almost reluctant in its praise. "Better than most men in their prime." Her hand brushed against his shoulder, a fleeting gesture that carried acknowledgement and reassurance. Caleb met her gaze, overwhelmed not only by exhaustion but by the raw intensity of their shared survival. The canyon fell silent once more, the only sounds the distant cry of a hawk and the whispering wind. Nayeli inspected the wagon briefly, taking what supplies they could carry. Water, dried food, and a small blanket found in the wreckage would help them survive the next leg of their journey. "We move at first light," she said finally. "Rest now. We have more distance to cover than you realize." Caleb lay back, staring at the sky through the narrow canyon opening. The fight had awakened something inside him, a stubborn spark of courage he thought the desert had extinguished. And Nayeli, she was no longer just a savior. She was a companion, an ally, and perhaps the only person he could trust with his life. Night fell, draping the canyon in darkness. Nayeli kept watch, silent and vigilant, while Caleb drifted into a fitful sleep, the images of the day's struggle replaying in his mind. Danger still lingered in the desert, and their journey was far from over. Yet for the first time, Caleb felt that survival was possible. Not as a solitary struggle, but as a shared endeavor to lives intertwined by fate, courage, and the unspoken promise that neither would face the wilderness alone. As the wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and scorched earth, Nayeli tightened the blanket around him and looked toward the stars. The desert was vast, merciless, and full of peril, but together, they would face it, and neither would falter. The next morning broke with an eerie stillness. The canyon, once alive with the echoes of wind and wildlife, seemed frozen in anticipation, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. Nayeli stirred the fire embers, coaxing a small flame to life. Caleb awoke slowly, every movement a jolt of pain through his battered body. He felt the lingering tension from the previous day's ambush. And the desert seemed to press down on him, heavy and unrelenting. Nayeli helped him mount his horse, her hands firm yet gentle. "We travel east today," she instructed. "The canyon opens up to a plateau where we can find better water and cover. Stay alert. The desert is not forgiving to the weak." Caleb nodded, wincing as the horse jolted under his weight. Despite the pain, he felt a growing determination. Nayeli had saved him not once, but repeatedly. And each act of protection was teaching him more about resilience, patience, and trust. He had survived against the odds, but now he realized survival required more than brute strength. It required observation, strategy, and unwavering focus. Hours passed under the scorching sun. The plateau stretched out before them, a vast expanse of golden sand interspersed with rocky outcroppings and hardy scrub. The heat shimmered like a living thing, bending the horizon and making distant objects appear to sway. Nayeli led steadily, her senses attuned to the faintest signs of danger. Every shadow, every movement of dust or wind was scrutinized. Caleb followed, struggling to keep pace, learning to anticipate her movements and trust her instincts. Suddenly, the sky darkened. Thick clouds gathered on the horizon, black and swollen, and a distant rumble echoed through the plateau. Nahili's eyes narrowed. "A storm," she muttered. "Not a normal one. This will be violent." Before Caleb could respond, the wind picked up, whipping sand and debris into their faces. The storm descended like a living force, battering them with sheets of wind and rain. Nayeli spurred her horse toward a cluster of boulders, seeking shelter in a narrow crevice. Caleb clung tightly behind her, every jolt sending pain through his ribs, every flash of lightning illuminating the perilous landscape around them. The storm was relentless. Rain pounded the earth, turning the desert dust into thick, clinging mud. Thunder cracked like cannon fire, and the wind tore at their clothing, threatening to unseat them from the horses. Caleb struggled to keep his balance, but Nayeli's steady presence anchored him. She guided the horses through the chaos, her eyes sharp even as the storm seemed intent on erasing the world around them. Hours passed in a blur of rain, wind, and fear. At one point, a flash flood roared through the plateau, threatening to sweep them away. Nayeli's quick thinking saved them. She maneuvered the horses to higher ground, her hands steady, her voice calm amidst the chaos. Caleb realized, with a mixture of awe and gratitude, that she was more than a warrior. She was a force of nature, perfectly attuned to the desert's temperament. By nightfall, the storm had passed, leaving a battered but resilient pair of travelers in its wake. They had survived the desert's fury, but Caleb could feel the strain in his own body. He dismounted, legs trembling, and allowed Nayeli to help him to a small sheltered area among the rocks. She tended to his cuts and bruises with practiced care, wrapping them in fresh cloth and offering water to drink. "You fought well today," she said quietly, her voice carrying both approval and a hint of admiration. Many would have given up long before the storm reached its peak. Caleb managed a weak smile. "I had good guidance," he admitted, his eyes meeting hers. "Couldn't have done it without you." Nayeli's gaze softened for a brief moment, just enough for him to see the humanity behind her strength. "We survived together," she replied simply. "The desert does not forgive those who rely only on themselves." As they settled for the night, Caleb reflected on the day's trials. The storm had tested their endurance, their courage, and their trust in one another. Through it all, Nayeli had been his constant, a steadfast presence that refused to let him fall. He realized that survival was no longer just about escaping danger, it was about connection, about shared strength in the face of overwhelming odds. The desert lay quiet now, the wind soft and the stars blinking coldly in the sky. Caleb drifted into a fitful sleep, comforted by the knowledge that Nayeli would watch over him, that she would not let him die alone. And as the canyon walls stood silently around them, he understood a truth he could not yet fully articulate. Survival was a bond, a promise, and in the heart of the wilderness, he had found both. The dawn broke pale and fragile, the desert bathed in a soft golden glow. The storm had left the plateau scarred and slick with mud, and a low mist curled around the rocks, like ghostly fingers. Nayeli rose first, moving with the fluid precision of someone whose body was inseparable from the land. She checked the horizon, noting the faint signs of distant movement, before tending to Caleb. "Time to move," she said. Her tone was gentle but firm. The desert doesn't rest, and neither can we. Caleb struggled to his feet, muscles stiff, every step a reminder of the battles and storms they had endured. But he could feel a quiet strength building within him. Nayeli had guided him through ambushes, storms, and exhaustion, and now, each step forward seemed a little less impossible, a little less frightening. The morning passed with tense silence, the wind whispering across the plateau. Suddenly, Nayeli halted. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned a narrow pass ahead. Caleb followed her gaze and caught sight of movement figures lurking among the rocks, their posture deliberate, predatory. Outlaws. Or worse, Nayeli murmured. They've been tracking us since the canyon. Caleb's chest tightened. He was still weak, still in pain, yet something in Nayeli's steady gaze gave him courage. What do we do? He asked, his voice hoarse. Survive, she said simply. We find cover, and we use the land against them. They moved cautiously, slipping between boulders and using shadows as shields. Nayeli instructed Caleb on when to stay silent, when to move, and when to observe. Every lesson was sharp, precise, a lifeline in the harsh wilderness. The outlaws' shouts echoed in the distance as they scouted for prey, but Nahel's awareness kept them hidden. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher and baking the plateau with relentless heat. When the outlaws discovered traces of their passage a broken branch, a hoofprint, they began to close in. Nayeli guided Caleb into a narrow ravine, nearly invisible from above. This is where we make our stand, she said, but you must trust me completely. Caleb nodded, understanding that failure could mean death. His trust was not blind, it had been earned through shared struggle, through her unyielding protection and guidance. He felt the weight of it now, a bond forged in fear, survival, and mutual respect. The outlaws approached, shouting threats, their horses straining against the rocky terrain. Nayeli moved with lethal precision, her knife and bow turning the ravine into a trap. Caleb followed her instructions, using rocks and natural cover to defend himself. Every movement was tense, every breath calculated. He realized that survival was no longer about fleeing or hiding, it was about timing, instinct, and unwavering trust in his companion. In the chaos, Nayeli turned to him. Now, she commanded, and Caleb acted. He threw a rock that struck one of the outlaws, giving Nayeli the opening she needed to disarm and incapacitate another. Their movements became a rhythm, a deadly dance forged from desperation and mutual reliance. By nightfall, the outlaws lay defeated or scattered across the plateau. Caleb collapsed against a boulder, muscles trembling, lungs heaving. Nayeli joined him, her expression calm but alert. You did well, she said softly. Better than I expected. You're learning, you're surviving. Caleb looked at her, exhaustion and awe mingling in his gaze. I couldn't have done it without you, he admitted. I don't even know your name. Nayeli's eyes softened briefly. Nayeli, she said simply. And you are learning the desert's lessons. That is enough for now. They settled for the night, the desert quiet save for the distant howl of a coyote. Caleb reflected on the day's trials, the ambush, the storm, the relentless pursuit. Each event had tested him, stripped him down to fear and exhaustion. Yet each had also strengthened the fragile bond between him and Nayeli. He realized that survival was more than avoiding death. It was about connection, trust, and the shared determination to endure, no matter the cost. As the stars blinked coldly overhead, Caleb and Nayeli kept watch over one another, each aware of the other's presence in the vast, merciless wilderness. The desert was unforgiving, but together, they had learned that even in its harshest trials, there could be strength, courage, and the quiet reassurance of companionship. The canyon walls loomed silently, a reminder that their journey was far from over. And though danger still waited beyond every ridge, every shadow, Caleb understood something essential. With Nayeli by his side, he would not face it alone. The morning sun spilled over the horizon like molten gold, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and crimson. The desert, harsh and unyielding, had tested them in every conceivable way: storms, ambushes, and exhaustion, but Caleb and Nayeli had endured. The night had been quiet, the stars fading as light claimed the sky. Yet the tension remained, like the static before a storm. Nayeli stood atop a rise, scanning the plateau ahead. We're close, she said, her voice calm but edged with determination. Beyond that ridge lies water, shade, and a path that can lead us out of this wasteland. But we must move carefully. There may be others, more dangerous than the outlaws we've faced. Caleb mounted slowly, wincing as the sun's heat beat down on his bruised body. Each movement reminded him of every battle, every misstep, every storm. Yet alongside the pain was a quiet strength, born from the trials they had faced together. Nayeli had guided him through it all, not merely with skill, but with an unwavering refusal to let him die alone. The path ahead was narrow, flanked by jagged cliffs and treacherous ridges. Shadows stretched long across the plateau, and every shift of light brought new dangers. Nayeli moved with the precision of someone who knew the desert intimately, and Caleb followed, trusting her implicitly. They had developed a rhythm over the past days, a silent communication forged in life-forward circumstances. Suddenly, movement flashed ahead. Figures emerged from behind boulders, armed and hostile. This time, it was not the ragged outlaws. They were organized, disciplined, and clearly aware of the terrain. Nayeli's eyes narrowed. "Scouts," she whispered. "We can't outrun them, not in our condition. We must fight smart." Caleb's heart pounded, but he remembered every lesson she had taught him: patience, observation, timing. They dismounted, moving into natural cover, each step measured and deliberate. Nayeli handed him a small knife and gestured to a vantage point. "Focus. Don't act rashly. Watch my lead." The engagement that followed was tense and calculated. Nayeli's movements were precise and lethal, each strike purposeful, each arrow released with deadly accuracy. Caleb mirrored her focus, blocking, striking, and creating distractions when she signaled. Their trust had become their greatest weapon. Each instinctive maneuver saved the other from harm. At a critical moment, an enemy attempted to flank them, forcing Caleb to confront his fear directly. He lunged forward, recalling Nayeli's instructions, using the terrain and the element of surprise. The strike was clumsy but effective, and Nayeli capitalized on the opening, disarming their opponent with fluid precision. Together, they neutralized the threat, their movements a seamless combination of guidance and action. When the last adversary fled or lay incapacitated, Caleb and Nayeli paused, chests heaving, sweat mingling with the grime of battle. The desert stretched silently around them, vast and merciless, yet for the first time, it felt like they had claimed a small victory, not just against enemies, but against the overwhelming odds that had surrounded them since their journey began. Nayeli turned to him, her expression softened, almost tender. "You've come far," she said quietly. "Stronger than you think, braver than you know." Caleb, still trembling from exertion and pain, met her gaze. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted, the words raw and honest. "You didn't let me die alone." She studied him for a long moment, then gave a faint smile. "And I won't. Not while there's breath in my body. That's a promise." Together, they continued toward the ridge, and beyond it, the promise of water, shelter, and safety. The canyon's end was still distant, the desert still harsh, yet they rode with a new sense of purpose. Every trial they had faced had forged a bond stronger than fear, pain, or exhaustion. Survival was no longer an individual struggle, it was shared, a testament to trust, courage, and unwavering commitment. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind them, Caleb realized something profound. The desert had not broken them. It had tested them, shaped them, and in doing so, had revealed the strength of their spirit and the power of companionship. Nayeli's hand on his shoulder, steady and reassuring, reminded him that survival was never just about enduring, it was about protecting, trusting, and caring for one another, even in the most merciless of places. And so, they rode on, two figures silhouetted against the rising sun, bound by experience, respect, and the quiet triumph of having survived together. The desert still stretched ahead, vast and unyielding, but for Caleb and Nayeli it no longer seemed insurmountable. They would face it side by side, unbroken and unafraid. In the end, it was not the battles won or the storms endured that defined MIT, was the promise kept, the hand extended, and the refusal to let the other face the wilderness alone. And in the heart of the desert, amid fire, wind, and shadow, they had survived.